Mick Mulvaney coming in as the new chief of staff for the White House. This as Michael Cohen gives his very first interview since being sentenced to 3 years in prison, saying Trump told Cohen to make hush payments to women, even though Trump knew it was wrong. Watch this.
Nothing at the Trump Organization was ever done unless it was run through Mr. Trump. He directed me, as I said in my allocution, and I said as well in the plea. He directed me to make the payments. He directed me to become involved in these matters.
He was trying to hide what you were doing, correct?
Correct.
And he knew it was wrong?
Of course.
And he was doing that to help his election?
Yes, he was very concerned about how this would affect the election.
To help his campaign?
To help him and the campaign.
All right, so you heard it there. Cohen making it absolutely clear. Two key claims. One, Trump directed the payments. It builds on NBC reporting that Trump was, in fact, in the room with Cohen and the National Enquirer publisher David Pecker discussing those hush money payments during the campaign. And the second Cohen claim is that Trump knew it was illegal. And here's the potentially damaging news for Trump today. New audio emerging from 2012 showing that Trump was indeed familiar with the relevant campaign finance laws. Specifically, it features Trump discussing how the law applied to the John Edwards case. Edwards, of course, arguing that payments to his mistress back then were not campaign finance violations. In fact, they were personal payments. Now, here's Trump in 2012 revealing that he was watching the case very closely.
I always thought he was a sleazebag, frankly. This is a very, very tough trial to start off with, and a lot of people are saying it's not a trial that the government's going to win. And frankly, a lot of people say, and a lot of very good lawyers have told me that the government doesn't have a good case. Well, I think despite what the lawyers are all saying, that it's not a very good case from the government.
All right, so Trump saying there on that recording, he spoke to a, quote, lot of very good lawyers about the case. That isn't Michael Cohen saying Trump knew about the campaign finance law. It's Trump destroying his own defense. With me now is Maya Wiley, who worked as a civil prosecutor for the Southern District and was counsel to the mayor of New York City. Former federal prosecutor Daniel Goldman, who was assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, and Alexi McCammon, political reporter for Axios. Alexi, let me begin with you in the news that Mick Mulvaney has now been tapped as the new chief of staff at the White House. Give us a quick sense, your reading of this president is about to face an onslaught of investigations from multiple fronts.
You know, Eamon, this chief of staff search has been anything but normal. And what is so wild to me in particular about this announcement today is that the first time that I heard from a source familiar with the White House transition that John Kelly was out as chief of staff and Mick Mulvaney was going to replace him was July 24th. I have heard Mick Mulvaney was going to be this person to replace Kelly for so long. And I think that's because now that it's finally happened, Trump sort of views him as someone who will be loyal to him and who will do what he says. Maybe not necessarily like a John Kelly type who tries to run a tight ship, but someone who he has seen sort of quietly behind the scenes fighting for this position for many, many months and showing to the president that he would be loyal to him in this really crucial position that Trump otherwise views as adversarial to him.
All right, so loyalty is obviously high on the president's list. Let's talk a little bit about Mick Mulvaney's expertise. Does he have any kind of experience dealing with legal crises? Is he going to be able to handle and manage the legal problems that this president is going to be facing? Not necessarily as a lawyer, but just even as a counselor to the president. Does he have that kind of legal expertise?
It is not clear that he has that type of legal expertise at a time, as you're alluding to, when Democrats are about to take back the House. They will have subpoena power across the board. They have vowed to launch an onslaught of investigations into folks, including Trump and everyone around him. Trump needs someone who can guide him on these legal and ethical matters in a way that Mick Mulvaney is not immediately cleared to be able to do. But at the same time, going through this, I think what President Trump will really want and need on a personal level, he thinks, is someone who can, again, tell him what he wants to hear and make him feel better personally, but that's not going to get him out of any legal trouble or help him with legal matters.
All right, Maya, so let me bring you in here and let's break down a little bit of what Michael Cohen was saying today. Obviously, it comes on a day the president has a new chief of staff. He's going to have to deal with a lot of these crises. But let's start with what Michael Cohen had to say today and how that moves the needle forward against the president. What was your takeaway from the Michael Cohen interview where he really said the president directed him every step of the way?
He reiterated and said very directly, and I would say in terms of demeanor, in terms of attitude, very credibly, this is something he understood and directed me to do. I actually thought the most important thing that he said, which was really a little new, was making very explicit and very clear that Donald Trump knew everything that was happening in the Trump Organization. And the reason that's important is both because of the potential campaign finance crimes, but also because there are other investigations that are going on out of the Southern District of New York and also out of the state Attorney General's office around the Trump Organization. And if that is a provable fact, and now you have Michael Cohen, who is cooperating, who says he's going to continue to talk to prosecutors, that means presumably that he's going to be able to give information that demonstrates that, I mean, we don't know, but presumably he might be able to demonstrate that knowledge. And knowledge is critical if you have to get a criminal, if you have to show that someone had criminal intent.
So, Dan, I want to get your reaction as well. But interestingly enough, the point that Michael Cohen also made in the interviews was that a lot of what he was telling Mueller to some extent knew about it because they had supporting documents and evidence. How damaging is that going to be for the argument that we heard Hogan Gidley try to make today, saying, hey, Michael Cohen is a known liar from day one. He should not be trusted?
So I actually think what's far more important than Michael Cohen's interview this morning is the fact that the Southern District asserted to a court that Donald Trump coordinated and directed Michael Cohen to make these payments, because the Southern District of New York, you'll remember, in April did those searches, and what they obtained is likely a treasure trove of information. And so that the fact that they could say that Cohen was credible about that indicates to me that they have a lot more evidence. But the problem that we run into, or the problem that the Southern District runs into in not only this investigation but any investigation into the Trump Organization, is that Michael Cohen is not cooperating with the Southern District of New York. He is not a witness available to them right now, and this is why he got 3 years in prison, is that he didn't go the full length that he needed to in order to become a full-on signed-up witness. He has provided information that they say is credible and forthright, but because he won't be fully debriefed and fully vetted, they can't use him. So
to that point, do you think the president is kind of, kicking himself a little bit, saying, I shouldn't have been speaking disparagingly of Michael Cohen? Because if Michael Cohen, as you say, he wasn't as forthcoming as a witness or a cooperating witness, he probably has an incentive now, since the president's been like totally name-calling him a weak, calling him a liar. Maybe now Michael Cohen's like, here I was trying to be loyal. I shouldn't be that way anymore.
No, because I think this is where the fact that the president cannot be indicted actually hurts Trump. Okay. Because if this goes to impeachment and a trial in the Senate, for example, Michael Cohen can testify there. He wouldn't testify in a criminal case right now against Donald Trump for the campaign finance. But it doesn't mean that Donald Trump didn't do it. And we still have enough evidence to believe that he did it. There's Michael Cohen, there's David Pecker, there's documents, there's recordings, there's the cover-up that hasn't gotten enough attention about how they cooked the books and records in order to funnel this through the Trump Organization. There's all sorts of evidence that is enough to say that Donald Trump did it, but he could not necessarily be charged with it in a criminal court.
Okay, so the other part of the president's defense has been that Michael Cohen, he told him deal with it. He knew that he was breaking the law. The president almost kind of playing that card like he didn't know what campaign finance laws were. We now have a recording of the president demonstrating that he knows very well what campaign finance laws were based on that 2012 recording we played. Is his argument essentially that argument shattered now because you have that recording? Is that recording something that, hey, you know what, lawyers can one day look at and say, you do know what the law was?
Well, I would start by saying it wasn't a credible argument to begin with, based on all the facts that we have out in public, including the fact that Donald Trump himself lied about whether he even knew about the payments. If you weren't participating willfully in a crime, why are you lying? You know you're lying. Yeah. You know you knew what you knew, and unless he has a undiagnosed mental illness that we don't know about. So there are tons of facts in this case, including what Michael Cohen himself has said, and including that there's a pattern of practice, of a way of organizing the work that also AMI is reinforcing in the case of Karen McDougal. I think that we, though, are, to be fair to Donald Trump, are overstating potentially the meaning of his statement, meaning saying you talked to lawyers about a different case and whether or not it was strong or not is not the same thing as saying you understand what a violation would be in your particular case. Because I would actually argue that while it's the same type of case in terms of payments, it's not enough that someone said, I once talked to a lawyer about a different case and therefore I've blown my argument. I just don't think it was a credible argument to begin with.
I was going to say, how many white-collar crimes can you get away with the defense being, I didn't know it was the law, sorry.
Particularly when you have to certify on your campaign finance disclosures as the head of the campaign.
Yeah, exactly. All right, joining me now is Democratic Congresswoman Jackie Speier of California. She's a member of the House Intelligence Committee, and she is out with a new article today where she asks bluntly, did Putin buy Donald Trump? Congresswoman, great to have you with us. Let's start with a big picture assessment of your reaction to what we are now hearing from Michael Cohen. What did you take away from everything you've heard about him?
Well, watching him, he looked like he was so exhausted he couldn't tell a lie anymore. I think that it's very clear that the special counsel has the goods on Donald Trump as it relates to his involvement in trying to secure the silence of these two women. The tapes that Michael Cohen had in his possession that the special counsel was able to obtain probably have more than enough evidence. And you have David Pecker, who says that he made that payment intending to assist Donald Trump in his campaign for election, and Donald Trump was in the room. So there's no question that Donald Trump knew about all of this. He was a one-man show. He's always been a one-man show. He had a small family company with about 50 employees. He knew precisely what was going on all the time.
So, Congresswoman, there's been two components to Michael Cohen's, if you will, cooperation here. You've got the hush money payments and the AMI David Pecker connection. You also have the connection to Russia and the Trump Tower in Moscow. Take a listen to Michael Cohen talking about Russia today.
The special counsel did say that you were doing your best to tell the truth about everything related to their investigation, everything related to Russia. Do you think President Trump is telling the truth about that?
No.
How does this end for Donald Trump?
You know, that sort of gets into the whole investigation right now. I don't want to jeopardize any of their investigations.
So, Congresswoman, what more do you think we're going to learn from Michael Cohen about that issue, the Russia connection to all of this?
Well, the Russia connection, I think, gets stronger and stronger by the day. I don't know that President Trump ever thought he was going to win. So this whole effort to try and move forward on the Trump Tower in Moscow was his winning, so to speak, because he was going to get that prize that he has wanted for a long time. And so he wanted that project to move forward during the campaign. So it doesn't surprise me at all. Now, Michael Cohen, I believe, will have lied not just to the special counsel, but to the Intelligence Committee as well when all is said and done.
Let me pose a question to you that you yourself asked in the article that you wrote. Did Putin buy Donald Trump? I'm going to give you a chance to answer that for our viewers tonight. What is your assessment?
I think he did. I mean, one of the elements of kompromat, which is the Russian word for, getting something on somebody, is sometimes you just pay them so that they are indebted to you. And that mansion in Florida that Rybolovlev actually purchased from Donald Trump during the height of the recession, in which it was a $45 million increase in value. He never saw the property and yet made that kind of an accelerated and extensive payment to him, I think was all part of a deal that was concocted by Putin.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.